During World War II, the Pentagon hired behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner to launch a series of experiments called Project Pigeon.
The first rule for teaching anything is to structure the situation so that the behavior is likely to occur.
The military wanted him to create pigeon-guided missiles.
So he built these boxes where he would put pigeons and there would be signs. And the signs the pigeons would have to hit, and then when they hit those, then eventually food would come out.
You might define reading as the ability to emit an appropriate differential response to written commands. Actually, pigeons are capable of good pattern discrimination.
And what he could demonstrate is very quickly this stimulus and reward system would feed the pigeons, and they would learn. Even these stupid creatures could learn exactly what they needed to do to survive. Well, that's exactly the structure we've built for Congress.
Shaping consists of reinforcing closer and closer approximations of the response we wish to condition. Sometimes we used a nudge or a kick under the table.
Just like the pigeons in the Skinner box experiments learned which buttons they needed to push to get the sustenance they needed to eat, so too Congress people learn which buttons they need to push to get the sustenance their campaigns need to survive.
And what politicians need most to survive is money to fuel their next campaign.
This Congress in the United States spends anywhere between 30 and 70% of its time raising campaign money. But it doesn't raise money from the average American. It raises money from a tiny, tiny fraction of the 1%.
They have become conditioned reinforcers, and they can exert a great deal of control over behavior.
And if that tiny fraction objects to anything Congress might want to do, it's extraordinarily hard to get Congress to do it.
Our subjects are available when we need them.
So when any major issue, like gun safety legislation, or healthcare reform, or the minimum wage comes up, the question is whether these funders oppose it or not. And if they oppose it, it's not going to happen.
The presentation of an aversive stimulus is called punishment.
It's simple. He who pays the piper calls the tune.
How did we get here? To a system where the rich and powerful steer our government into serving them instead of the people who elected it. To answer that, we have to go back to the 1970s.
The Vietnam War is raging, and there are protests in the streets. There's also a rising movement of consumer protection.
The abuses are flagrant. Hot dogs made of substandard meat. Toothpastes that don't prevent cavities.
Ralph Nader is taking on the big car companies.
Testifying here this morning, Mr. Nader, I think it's a tribute that I don't have to take the time to introduce you if you just proceed.
Saying that they're making unsafe cars and they're profiting at the expense of people's safety. And there is a rising environmental movement.
The public begins to demand their representatives in government fix the problems, and government responds. President Nixon creates the EPA. Congress passes the Clean Air and Water Acts, and other governmental agencies step in to begin imposing new health and safety regulations on big business.
So you're beginning to get a great pushback, and the corporate captains who have been making tons of money and feeling like they sort of rule society are thrown back on their heels.
Enter Lewis F. Powell.
So Lewis Powell was kind of a big deal Virginia lawyer, represented big corporations, especially big tobacco.
In 1971, there's a paper written by Lewis Powell, who would later be a Supreme Court justice, and he warns, corporate America, you better fight back because you're going to lose your place in society.
The confidential paper becomes known as the Powell Memo.
Even to this day, I find that people are amazed when they hear about it because it is like a document that would exist in a fictional account.
Powell argues that corporate America is under an unprecedented attack and is losing its grip on the levers of power. The memo presents a detailed battle plan for how to secretly get it back.
Everybody from Ralph Nader to Ho Chi Minh were freaking him and his circle out, like, oh my God, what's happening?
He basically said, look, if we don't organize to defend business against populist regulation, America as we know it is going to disappear.
Powell warns that the right needs to launch a shadow campaign to influence academia, sway the courts, and fight back against liberal voices in the media.
It's like this call to arms of corporate America.
For much of the 70s, the public sees elected officials as something like their lawyer, the place to go to get a local river cleaned up or an unsafe car recalled.
There is padding here, presumably might reduce the possibility of getting your teeth broken if you hit it.
But for Powell's memo to work, that needs to change. And by 1980, that relationship between the public and their government will come under attack.
Thank you very much.
Skyrocketing inflation and slow growth produce a new phenomenon in America. They call it stagflation. Millions are struggling more than they've had to in a generation. And suddenly, a lot of Americans are receptive to the idea that big government is to blame. All of this sets the stage for a presidential candidate who will echo Powell's call to arms.
And then he took another crack at the American people and said that we had inflation because you and I were living too well. You and I living too well is not the cause of inflation. We have inflation because government is living too well.